Hi, welcome back to another session of Sustainable Economics. As usual, our time usually is limited for only around 17 or 18 minutes per one of these sessions. So let me just jump into it and see if we can deal with a number of these issues. Essentially, I want to deal with a few ideas that you have already read in Chapter 1. In particular, maybe a few words about sustainability. A little bit about what is meant by geometric growth, and also a few words about IPAT that we sort of had mentioned last time very briefly. The first notion is obviously, why is it that we're interested in sustainability? Well, and what does it mean really to be sustainable? I guess we can spend really the whole semester talking about this particular issue, but in a nutshell, the definition that was provided by Our Common Future, the 1982 conference sponsored by the UN, which was the second conference to deal with the issue of environmentalism and sustainability, was the one that really provided probably the best definition, as again it has been mentioned in your book. In case that definition didn't make that much sense, let me reiterate from right now that it is really essentially based on an economic idea. An economic idea that is known as Pareto optimality in essence. What it really says, very simply, is that if you have a system that is composed of two individuals, Pete and Paul, if you have to take from Pete in order to give Paul, then the overall welfare of that particular system has not improved. If you can give to one of them without taking from the other, then definitely you should do it. Now, in terms of sustainability, what does that mean? Well, all what it means really essentially is to think of Pete as being the present and Paul is the future. So if you are giving Pete right now a better standard of living at the expense of the future, that is to say by taking away from Paul, then that is definitely something that should be avoided. It means that the system is not sustainable. It means that the system will not be capable of regenerating itself for a very long period of time into the future. And what we mean by that, by the way, the very long period of time, ideally, it's not only the next 50 years or 100 years or 200 years. It's probably a perpetual, until there comes such a time that life on Earth would not be possible any longer. So really, I mean, if you are to define it in that way, you want a system to be sustainable for an extraordinary length of time. And the other thing that is important about sustainability is that it's not only ecological. You want it to be both ecological and social and political at the same time. Now that is crucially important, because really what you're really saying is that environmental awareness should not be limited only to the field of open spaces and green grass, but it depends on social equity, and it depends on whether the political system, the institutional setup, the architecture that underlies the way that the world is currently configured is going to be able to sustain itself. Ultimately, as we'll find out if we get a chance to talk about this some more, given that this is only an introductory course, I would like for you to think about whether the system itself, capitalism, the market economy, is really a sustainable system. And I hope that you'd agree right from the beginning, without really even giving it that much thought, is that no, the system is not sustainable, because the system is built on the notion of economic growth. If you're gonna grow, then it means that the level of economic activity needs to increase. But pollution and our capacity to be able to provide all of these natural resources is dwindling as the scale of operation goes up. And that, to a very large extent, is really one of the reasons why is it that modern environmentalism became a great big issue only over the past, let's assume, 60 years or so, only as a result of the mid-60s, early 60s actually. the very common, by the way, watershed for that is definitely the publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962, because that is the first time that we noticed that we have been abusing our natural capital, and we're running out of our natural capital. You still have a school of thought, as probably you have found out from that particular list about the 9 different alternatives that you have in order to deal with sustainability, that believes that natural capital isn't really that important and that we can really go ahead and substitute for it. But obviously that is not the point of view of the radical environmentalists or the deep ecologists. They believe that there is a particular set that cannot be manufactured, and that is the natural capital. And the more we use the natural capital, the less that we're going to have. So actually there's a term that I would like you, if possible, to try and avoid at any cost. Don't ever use the term that there is such a thing as sustainable growth. Sustainable growth is an oxymoron. There never is such a thing. I mean, it just doesn't make sense to speak of a finite base upon which you can grow indefinitely. So capitalism, to go back to this idea of capitalism really is predicated on the notion that we're going to have economic growth all the time. But if we're going to have economic growth and keep on expanding, and therefore keep on producing more and more garbage heaps, we're going to have more and more production, and we're going to have more and more problems. The other thing that I'd like to probably mention right now, as I said, is this issue of geometric growth. I'm sure probably many of you have had the chance to think about it. But geometric growth, all what it means, essentially, is that it is an application of what is known as the rule of 70. The rule of 70 means that if something grows at 1%, it will double every 70 years, and not every 100 years. Now, another very simple application, or at least illustration, I should say, of the rule of 70 is the rule of thumb, which is pretty accurate, by the way, but I mean, it's not 100% accurate. And that is, if you start with any value that you want, if you double it 10 times, then it would have increased by a factor of 1,000. I mean, try to work it out very quickly and you'll find out. If you start with 1, it becomes 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, 1024. So all what it takes is 10 doubling. So if you had started with 1,000, you'd wind up with 1,000,000. So if you want to become a millionaire, all what you've got to do, therefore, is start with 1,000 and have it increase at such a rate whereby you'll be able to have 10 doublings during your lifetime or during that particular period of time in which you are interested. What is it that's going to determine the length of each doubling? Well, it's going to be the interest rate, the rate of growth. So if you want to grow, let's assume, at 10%, then things will double every 7 years. If you're going to grow at 7%, they will double every 10 years, and so on and so forth. Why is this very important? It's crucial because of the size of the population. We've never been environmentally friendly all throughout history, and we never would be. But at one time when our numbers were small, the level of economic activity was not leaving behind a great environmental impact. That's to say, the capacity of the ecosystem to regenerate was greater than the pollution and the waste that we are producing. But as our numbers have grown, and as the scale of operation has grown, then obviously we have gotten right now to that particular point, whereby it has become crucial to try and limit, and not only limit, by limit I mean place a lid on the maximum number of population and hopefully even decrease it. Because if population is going to grow at 3% a year, then it will double, 70 over 3, almost every 23, 24 years. But if you're going to have population grow at 1% a year, then it will double only every 35 years. And actually, if it doesn't grow at all, that would be definitely preferable. While on the other hand, if the size of the population is to decrease, then again that will be something that is not very difficult to achieve. All what you need to do is to have a lower fertility rate. A fertility rate that is under 2% will bring about a decrease in the population after 70 years or so. So whenever we talk about sustainability in the long run, it is not something that will ever be feasible unless we go ahead and we deal with the issue of human population. And to deal with the issue of human population, we must definitely understand the issue of geometric growth. So we've got to really shoot for a particular fertility rate that will not bring about a geometric rate of growth. To give you a very simple example, it took us forever, I mean literally speaking from the beginning of time up until 1800 or the very early 1800 to become 1 billion. And then in the past 200 years, we've gone from 1 billion to 7 billion. Right now we add 1 billion every 12 years. And that is only a reflection of geometric growth. The other very quick thing that we need to talk about is that idea of IPAT. IPAT again is very, very closely related to the issue of population. It was introduced by Paul Ehrlich, who was having a discussion at one time with Commoner, and they were talking about what are the basic factors that bring about or a person should be aware of whenever we talk about environmental impact. And ultimately Ehrlich went ahead and created this particular formula, which is called IPAT. I is equal to PAT. I is the environmental impact, P is the number of population, A is the level of affluence, i.e. the level of consumption, and T is the technology. One of the things why I am so much interested in this, I definitely believe that one would never be able to talk about any environmental matter without keeping in the back of one's mind all the time this idea about IPAT. But what is really also crucially important is the fact that very often it is a little bit misinterpreted by whenever it is written as I is equal to P times A times T. It doesn't make lots of sense to say that I is equal to P times A times T. It is extremely restrictive. The much better way of discussing this particular problem is to say that I is a function of three variables: population, affluence, and technology. As probably some of you know, if you've heard of this before, the relationship between the impact, the environmental impact, and population is positive. That between the level of affluence, i.e. consumption or lifestyles, and the impact is also going to be positive, while that between technology, improvement in technology, and impact is negative. So it is theoretically possible to some extent, under some circumstances, for technology to at least place a lid on the rate of increase of the environmental impact. But what is clear is that environmentalism is not only a function of the number of people, it's not only a function of the level of affluence, it's not only a function of technology, but it's a function of the interactions between the three of them. And that's why you have to then, if you think that the three of them interact with each other, you have to reject the very simple proposition that I is equal to P times A times T. And then the other thing, by the way, that's worth also mentioning and stressing right from the beginning, is that I is equal to P times A times T, or even if it is expressed as I is equal to a function of P times P, A, and T, whatever that relationship between them turns out to be, then it's not a relationship that really is going to, that one is going to go ahead and be able to compute quantitatively, because it depends on what is it that you mean by the environmental impact, and how is it that you're going to measure consumption, and how is it that you're going to measure technology. So really it's much more of a general statement about the general relationships between these three, and to show that ultimately this issue of environmentalism is going to be affected by the three of them. Now I'd like to go back to a little bit to the issue of sustainability and mention a number of things. The first thing that I would like to mention is that one of the most important issues that is listed in the book as one of the 9 ways of dealing with sustainability is that of internalizing the external cost. So what is an external cost? An external cost is really a very important idea in economics. What it means is that whenever you go ahead and you produce a particular item, in general, that process of production in a market economy is going to have certain byproducts that the market does not include in the cost of that particular item. I mean, a very simple example, probably the most common example, is to assume that you have a nuclear power plant right next to a river, because we all well know that a nuclear power plant needs to be able to cool the core reactor, and so it needs a very big supply of water. What happens is that the water normally is pumped back into the river at a high temperature, and so it's going to kill the marine life. But that is never taken into consideration whenever they try to price the cost of that particular electricity. So an externality, therefore, is always a byproduct that would have increased the cost of an item, but normally it doesn't get included under the market mechanism, because there is no market for these externalities. So we have to pass laws, therefore, in order to force that particular firm or corporation, whenever it is producing that particular product, to internalize the cost. And the only way to do that is to go ahead and probably go ahead and tax them. So one very popular name for that is usually referred to as the Pigou effect. And Pigou was one of the spokesmen of mainstream economics around 100 years ago, at the time of Keynes. Keynes, for those of you who probably know this, Keynes started his book, by his major treatise, by attacking the concept of mainstream economics as being promoted by Pigou. So it is crucially important, therefore, in order to try and deal with the question of sustainability, is to have accurate pricing. But you can't have accurate pricing whenever there are externalities. And the interesting thing about this is that practically every single process of production has an externality. And so in essence, really what you're saying is that the market price of every good that you can think of is probably a fictitious market price. Now, why is that important? Well, if that cost is not included, it means that the market price is really a fictitious market price. That is to say, it is even lower than what it should be. So if the price is lower, what does that mean? It means that we're going to be consuming more. If we're consuming more, it means that we are over-allocating. So if we are over-allocating, therefore, we do not have an efficient process of production. So in order to make the system more efficient, you've got to go ahead and internalize the cost. Now, as big as that is and as important as it is, I don't think that by itself that is capable of really bringing about a efficient system and sustainable economics. But at least it is one very important element that people speak about. The other important element that we don't want to say much about right now, because later on in the syllabus we're going to do even one reading by Coase. But Coase is a person who came up with a system that is really, in essence, a system that will contradict to some extent what we have just said about Pigou, who says that the only way to make the system efficient is to go ahead and apply a tax, a Pigouvian tax. Coase came up with an explanation, and again later on, once you read the Coase article, you'll find out that it is not a very practical, it's a very theoretical explanation that makes sense in theory, but in reality it doesn't, because it's based on very many assumptions that really are not practical. But in essence, if that was to be practical, it will show that two particular parties can go ahead and negotiate with each other in order to arrive at an efficient solution without any taxes. And what is that? Why is it important to say without any taxes? Because who is it that applies the taxes? It's the government. So you're saying, therefore, in that particular sense, that there is no need for government, which takes us back to the basics of economics, that's to say, to have an economy with practically no government, or as small of a government as possible. Because, as again, I hope all of you know, that mainstream economics rests definitely on the Smithian idea, and one of the single most important ideas in Smith is that of laissez-faire. And laissez-faire means really that ideally you don't want to have a government, but we have government only because it's a necessary evil as a result of two things. Because we need somebody to protect the borders, and we need somebody to protect the internal peace. So had it not been for these two things, in an ideal world, there wouldn't be war, and in an ideal world, there wouldn't be any need for a police force, and so in a state of bliss, there wouldn't be any need for government. The other thing, which again we're going to devote probably a week of study for, so right now we'll just mention it, is that every single environmental criticism of mainstream economics and every single effort to try and speak about the need for sustainability will probably start with something very similar to what we have spoken about, but it really goes much more into the details by saying that we must reform our national accounting system, because we are saying that our national accounting system, over and above the idea of not internalizing all the externalities, it fails to consider the production of bads. That's to say, the GDP, very simply, as probably many of you know, is the money market value of the final goods and services produced. Unfortunately, in our society, we don't produce only goods, but we produce lots of bads. And we do not, and bads therefore should be excluded and not included into the GDP. So that is another system that we'll have to talk about later on. The 1, 2, 3, 4. The fourth one that I wanted to mention out of the 9, because the others are very simple and straightforward, is the idea of the Hartwick rule. The Hartwick rule, and again, it's not mentioned very clearly in the book, because remember, this is an introduction, and this chapter is only an introduction, so all of these things are going to be discussed a little bit later on if we get a chance. But the Hartwick rule essentially is saying that a system can become sustainable if we go ahead and invest all the rent. But that ultimately really, again, has been shown, and I can show it to you mathematically if we get a chance, but probably we won't, is really not true. So actually it has been discredited, this particular idea, because it is based on what is known as weak sustainability and not strong sustainability. So with that, let me leave you with this, and hopefully you will get a chance to talk about many of these things later on. But by the way, before we leave, maybe, I'm not sure that we mentioned that last time, but maybe I should mention it right now. The first international conference that deals with environmentalism was really only in 1972. The UN chooses these basic themes, and they have a conference about them every 10 years. So the first one was really the Stockholm Conference. And it was known as the Stockholm Conference, and came up with the Stockholm Declaration. It was the first time that we were aware of this issue of sustainability and of environmentalism and economic growth. Sustainability became an issue in the second conference in 1982, which is known as Our Common Future, or the Brundtland Commission. The third conference was that of 1992, which was held at Rio, and it's also known as Agenda 21. Then obviously we had 2002, which was in Johannesburg, and in 2012 we had Rio plus 20, and the notion of sustainable growth, or sorry, sustainable development, was really highlighted in the Rio plus 20. So as you can see, we became aware of this problem around 40 years ago or so, and it has been built ever since then. And right now, we are more certain than ever that the world is living way beyond its capacity. And so we don't have to really talk only about sustainability and sustainable development, but we need to reject all growth, and we need actually to try and minimize the scale of operation in practically all fields. And one of the best areas whereby that is extremely evident is that of climate change. So again, if we get a chance, we'll talk about that some more later on. Okay, bye-bye. Thank you.